Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Samech Vov Amud Beis. 2 lines from the top. The Gemara had previously taught us in the name of Shmuel, when we have 2 chatzeiros, zu lifnim mizu, 1 inner chotzer and 1 outer chotzer. If the inner chotzer does not make an erev chatzeiros, according to everybody, not only Rabbi Akiva, even the Rabbanon, even if the outer chotzer will make its own erev chatzeiros, the inner chotzer will prohibit, will be oiser the outer chotzer. Since the inner chotzer has its regel, its drisas haregel to walk through the outer chotzer to get to the Rishus HaRabim, without the inner chotzer making its own erev chatzeiros, it will oiser prohibit the outer chotzer. They could go ahead and make not only their own erev chatzeiros, they can then enjoin together with the outer chotzer with 1 chotzer, and that would then permit each one to then carry. Another option they have is to mevatel the reshus. The inner people can mevatel the reshus to the outer chotzer, and that will also then permit the people in the outer chotzer to go ahead and use their outer chotzer. The Gemara now goes on to say, Omar Rav Yosef, Lo shmiali hashmaitza. Rav Yosef says, I did not hear this halacha that we just said in the name of Shmuel. Once again, when you have 2 chatzeiros, an inner and an outer chotzer, when the inner chotzer did not make its erev chatzeiros, even if the outer chotzer did, it will oiser the outer chotzer. Omar le Abaye. Abaye says to Rav Yosef, At amris nihilon. You did teach us this. In other words, he's reminding Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef, the Gemara has taught us in different places that he had a certain illness and he forgot much of his learning. So therefore, Abaye, his Talmud, had to remind him of things that he had taught beforehand. So he says to him, At amris nihilon. You, Rav Yosef, did teach this to us. V'aha amros nihilon. And in this is what you had taught us. The following. D'omar Shmuel, that which Shmuel said. Ein bitul reshus mechatzer lechatzer. Ve'ein bitul reshus bechurva. You cannot mevatel your reshus from one chatzer to another chatzer. And when you have 2 batim, 2 houses with a churva in between the 2 houses, then you can also not mevatel your reshus to then go ahead and use that churva, because when was it that they permitted to mevatel reshus one to the other? That's going to be in a situation where it's residential, where they're using that area. But here it's a churva in between the 2 batim, so therefore one cannot mevatel his reshus to the other one and use the area. Va'amris lon, and this is what you had said, Rav Yosef, to us in the statement that Shmuel made. Allah ki omar Shmuel, when Shmuel said this, ein bitul reshus mechatzer lechatzer, when he made this statement, you cannot mevatel one reshus from chatzer to the chatzer, when was he talking about? Lo amron el shtei chatzeiros upesach echad beineim. The scenario that Shmuel was talking about, you, Rav Yosef, had taught us, was that when you have 2 chatzeros side by side, each one is opened up to the Rishus HaRabim or to the Mavui, and they have also an opening, an entrance between the 2 of them. So they're both independent. On that, you, Rav Yosef, said that Shmuel said, you cannot mevatel your Rishus one to the other. Although they can make an erev chatzeiros between the 2 chatzeiros to enjoin them as one, but they cannot mevatel their shoes one to the other. That's what you had said in the name of Shmuel. But in a scenario when you had 2 chatzers, one within the other, that means there was an inner chatzar and an outer chatzar, the scenario that we had spoken about before, where by the inner chatzar has drisas haregel, can walk through the outer chatzar to get to the mavui, the reshus harabim. There, in that scenario, then Shmuel said you could go ahead and mevatel. Since they are going to be oiser one on the other, then they have the rights also to mevatel the reshus. Omar le, Rav Yosef now turns back to Abaye, and he says to him, Ona amina mishmei de Shmuel hachi. Did I say this in the name of Shmuel? Shmuel ein lonu be'eruvin elo kiloshem mishnaseinu. behold, Shmuel has said in regards to Eruvin, we must say exactly like the lashon of our Mishnah. Now Rav Yosef said, what did he mean? Now Rav Yosef explains his words. Anshe chatzir v'loy anshe chatzeros. In regards to the kula of relinquishing one's rights, being mevatel his reshus, it says chatzer, anshe chatzer, singular, and not anshe chatzeros. And therefore, over here, you're not able to mevatel your reshus from chatzer to chatzer. Omar le, Abaye then turned back to Rav Yosef and he says to him, Amris lon mishmei de Shmuel, you had said in the name of Shmuel, Ein lonu be'eruvin el b'loshen mishnah seinu. We do not say in Eruvin other than we're medayik the loshen of the Mishnah. But it wasn't the Mishnah you, Rav Yosef, had stated before in regards to being mevatel reshus. No, it didn't say that in regards to that it has to be only singular and not plural, chatzer, not chatzeros. No, it was referring to a different Mishnah in Eruvin. Aha amislon. It was on this that you said, shehamavui lechatzeros kechatzer lebatim. When you want to go ahead and fix a mavui by making a kara, a crossbeam, or lechi, a side post, the way you can go ahead and do that is only when the mavui has at least 2 chatzeros that are opened up to the mavui, and each chatzer has at least 2 batim that are opened up to each mavui. Then you can go ahead and fix that mavui. 2 batim are opened up to at least 1 chatzer. Then you can go ahead and fix the mavui with a lechi or with a kara. That's what he meant when you have to say you have to medayek the lashon of the Mishnah in Eruvin. That was what Rav Yosef was what Shmuel was referring to. The Gemara now brings back the previous statement, Gufa. Omar Shmuel ein bitul rishus mechatzer lechatzer ve'ein bitul rishus bechurva. Explains the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan is choylek on that statement that Shmuel had just made. Rabbi Yochanan Omar yesh bitul rishus mechatzer lechatzer ve'yesh bitul rishus bechurva. The exact opposite of Shmuel holds. Here Rabbi Yochanan says there is bitul rishus, both mechatzer lechatzer as well as chatzer lechurva. And we need both cases to show that Shmuel holds his shita and that Rabbi Yochanan is cholek and holds his shita as follows. If we only heard the case of chatzer lechatzer, when the Shmuel say that there is no bitul rishus, because each chatzer has their own independent area to use, their own rishus, then they cannot mevatel rishus on the rishus. But in the case of churva, where they have to share the same area, then maybe you would say that Shmuel would agree with Rabbi Yochanan and say you can go ahead and mevatel the rishus. So therefore we need both cases to teach that Shmuel says no. In both scenarios you cannot mevatel rishus. And if you only taught this one, that's where Rabbi Yochanan stated his din in regards to the case of churva. But in the case of the 2 chatzeros, then he would agree with Shmuel. You cannot mevatel rishus. Therefore, we need both cases to teach that Shmuel holds you cannot mevatel rishus, and that Rabbi Yochanan holds that you can mevatel rishus. Says the Gemara Vayter, Omar Abaye. Abaye said, Hoda Omar Shmuel, ein bitul rishus mechatzer lechatzer. Lo ya'amaron elo b'shtei chatzeros u'pesach echad beinehem. When did he say that din? That you can mevatel rishus from chatzer to chatzer. That's talking about a scenario when you have 2 side-by-side chatzeros. Each one has an entrance, again, to the mavui or to the rishus harabim. Each one also has an entrance to each other. Then he says you can go ahead and make an Erev Chatzos, but you cannot mevatel the reshus. Aval beis chatzer zu lifnim mizu. But if you have 2 chatzers, one inside and one outside chatzer, where the inside chatzer needs to walk through the outside chatzer to get out to the mavui or the reshus harabim. So mitoisha oisim mevatlin, because they are oiser on each other. The inner will oiser the outer. Thereby, they cannot go ahead And thereby they are able, rather, to go ahead and both either make an Eruv, if they wish, and enjoy both Chatzeros, or they can also mevatel the Rishus, one to the other. Rava Amar, Afilu Shtei Chatzer Zilu Fnei Mizu. Rava comes to be Choylek, and he says that even in a scenario when you do have two Chatzers, one within the other, sometimes, granted that it is mevatlin, I agree, but sometimes it's not. They are not able to mevatel the rishus. Ketzad, how is this so? He says, Nosnu erum b'chitzoino. Now you have again the inner chotzer together with the outer chotzer, and each one made their own independent eruv chatzeros, and then they enjoin by the inner one placing its chotzer inside one of the batim of the outer chatzeros. So that's nasnu eruvin b'chitzoino. V'shochach echod bein min ha'pnimis bein min chitzonis v'lo erav. And one of the people in the either inner chotzer or the outer chotzer did not also join that eruv. Shtei nasuros, both the inner chotzer as well as the outer chotzer will be osir. Now he says in a scenario where they put the eruv in the inner chotzer, nasnu eruvan bepnimis. They took the eruv chatzeros that was in the outer chotzer, and they took it and they placed it in a bias in the inner chotzer to enjoin both the inner and the outer chatzeros. V'shachach echad min ha'pnimis v'lo eruv. If one of the people in the inner chotzer did not join the eruv, Shtei nasurus, both the inner as well as the outer chatzeros will be osir. However, shochach echad mina chitzoina, if one of the outer people of the outer chatzeros did not himself be included, was not included in the eruv, veloy erav pnimis muteres v'chitzoina asura. Then the inner chatzer would be mutter, while the outer one will be asur. The Gemara is going to explain these scenarios. Going back now to the first scenario, where they placed the eruv in the outer chotzer. That means again, each one made an independent chotzer, eruv chatzeros, whereas the inner chotzer then took its eruv and then placed it in the bias of the outer chotzer, trying to then enjoin the two chatzeros. So says the Gemara, Nasnu eruvan b'chitzoino. They placed that eruv in the outer chotzer. V'shochach echad bein min ha'pnimis bein min chitzonis v'lo erav shtei nasuros. So he stated before that if either one from the inner chotzer or one person from the outer chotzer neglected to be part of that eruv, then both the inner as well as the outer chatzeros will be prohibited. Says the Gemara to analyze this. Hai bar pnimis laman nivtil. The one who is in the inner chatzer. Let's work out each scenario. We said both the inner and the outer one forgot, if either the inner or the outer one forgot to be included in the eruv, they're both also. Let's start with the inner one. If the one who was the inner person in the inner chatzer was not included in the eruv, ask the Gemara, Laman Niftil, who could he go ahead and mevatel? Who would he be able to then go ahead and relinquish his rights to? Let's analyze. Livto livnei pnimis. To say that he's mevatel his rights to the people in the inner chotzer, then les le'arvei gabayu. The eruv is in the outer chotzer. And since they were enjoining the inner and the outer together, the fact that he's mevatel his rishus to the inner will not be sufficient. It will also prohibit the outer ones. That's where the eruv is. Live till livnei, the other scenario. Live till livnei chitzoino. Let's say the inner person who neglected to be part of the eruv, then is mevatel his rishus to the outer chotzer. Ein bitul rishus mechotzer lechotzer. We said, behold, that Rava is choylek now on Abai, and he says that you do not have a bitul rishus from chotzer to chotzer. So therefore, that would also not be a possibility. So therefore, that will the oyster on both of them. Hi bar chitzoina. Now let's go to the other possibility. We said if the one who is in the outer chotzer also neglected, if he were to neglect then being part of the eruv, what would be the possibility of him being vatal his reshus? Says the Gemara, Hi bar chitzoino leman miftil. The one who was in the outer chutz who neglected to be making part of the eruv, who could he go ahead and mevatel his reshus to? Livtil livnei chitzoino, for him to mevatel his shus from somebody in his chutzer, the outer chutzer, ika pnimis da asra alaya. The fact that the inner chutzer did not have the reshus being mevatel to them, they'll come to oyser on the outer chutzer. Livto livnei pnimis, if the other possibility would be that the outer person who neglected to make his eruv then is mevatel's reshus to the pnimis, that also is not a possibility. Livto livnei pnimis ein bitto reshus mechatzer lechatzer. Again, Rava says that it will not work to mevatel reshus from chatzer to chatzer. So that also is not a possibility. So that's why when you place the eruv in the outer chatzer, whether the inner or the outer person forgot to make his eruv, neither one can mevatel reshus, and therefore they'll both be aser. Now the Gemara turns to the other situation where they placed the eruv in the inner chotzer. Says the Gemara, Nosnu eruvin bepnimis. They placed the eruv in the inside. Again, we're saying that the outer one and the inner one, they made, let's say, their own eruv chatzeros independently for their own chotzer. Then they want to join the two chatzeros together. So the outer chotzer takes the eruv chatzeros from the bayis that was in and brings it to now into a bayis inside the inner chotzer to enjoin the two chatzeros. V'shochach echad min hapnimis v'lo eruv shtei masuros. And somebody from the inner chotzer neglected to then be part of the eruv. He oisers both the inner and the outer chatzeros. Says the Gemara to explain. Hi bar pnimis leman miftil, because who can he go ahead and mevatel his reshus to? Live to livnei hapnimis, for him to mevatel his shus to the people in his chotzer, the pnimis. Ika chitzoina da asra alayu. Then they're going to then go have there's going to be the chitzoina who will oyser on them because they enjoin together to be part of one unit. And since they only mevatel shus to the inner, so the outer ones are going to then oyser the inner ones as well. Live to livnei chitzoina, to mevatel their reshus, his reshus, to also to the one who is in the outer one, not only to the inner one, but also to the outer one. That's also not a possibility because ein bitul reshus bechatzer lechatzer. We said that you cannot mevatel shus. It says Rava from chatzer to chatzer. That's also not a possibility. So in that scenario, when the person who was on the inside forgot to and neglected to make the eruv, he will not be able to mevatel reshus, not to the people on the inside, not to the people on the outside. Both will be aser. We're on top of Samech Zayin Amud Aleph. Shochach echad min hachitzoina. But over here, if he forgot, he neglected one of the people from the outer chotzer to make the eruv, v'lo eruv, vadai pnimis muteres. Here we say that the inner chotzer would be muter on their own. Why? Because the achta dosha, because we can say close the gate, the doors, umishtamsha v'chitzoina asura, and use the chotzer. In other words, the pnimis can go ahead and use their chotzer, and the chitzona will be aser. So we can force them, so to speak, to close their doors and allow the inner chotzer to then have their rights alone, and the outer chotzer will be aser. Omar le Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua le Rava. Now, Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua asked Rava on the scenario that he just mentioned the following question: V'chi shochach echad min hapnimis. In the scenario that one of the inner people from the inner chotzer neglected to make the eruv, v'lo eruv, amai shtein asuros. Why would it make both the inner and the outer chatzeros aser? Liv til hai bar pnimis. Livnei pnimis. Let the person who neglected to make his eruv in the inner chotzer, let him mevatel his reshus to the people in the inner chotzer. V'teisi chitzoino v'tishtri bahadayu, and bring the outer chotzer and allow them to then go ahead and be mutter together with them. In other words, since the inner one was mevatel's use to the inner people, to the inner chotzer, so now let us say that they go ahead and bring to the chitzoin of a tishtari and permit them together. So he asked, Rava says back to him, Kiman, Like, who are you suggesting? Like, Kirebi Eliezer? This goes like Rabbi Eliezer, what you're suggesting. The Omar Eino Tzorich Levato Reshus Lekol Echad Ve'echad. It's enough to Levato Reshus in general, and that will be as if it's Mevato to each one, without having to go Mevato to each one separately. However, Ki Kaminon, however, that which I'm stated before, Rava says, is L'Rabban who are Choylek and Rabbi Eliezer. V'da'amrei, because they required Tzorich Levato Lekol Echad Ve'echad. You have to go ahead and Mevato your Reshus to each and every one. And therefore, that's not going to be a possibility.